I am often asked what Linux distribution do I recommend to a new Linux user, someone that's never used Linux before, never installed Linux, knows nothing about Linux. Well, to answer that question, we really need to figure out how many Linux distributions are there out there anyway. I mean, if I go to the DistroWatch.com page here, on the side here you have their page hit rankings, where they try to rank popularity among Linux distributions. They have a list of 100 distributions that they track here in these page hit rankings. Now, these page hit rankings at DistroWatch.com, they're not very accurate to measure distro popularity. In fact, they're very inaccurate because they're easy to game. All it does is measure page hits to the individual distro pages in DistroWatch.com. So, we have to consider that, but it is something to go on. If a distribution is in the top 10 or even the top 20 in DistroWatch, then chances are it has a pretty good following behind it, has a pretty good community, a pretty substantial install base, and you'll probably not have too much trouble getting support when you need it from the community. But really, how many distros are there? I'm surely there's more than this 100 that's in DistroWatch's page hit ranking list. If I go to the top of DistroWatch.com here, I've got this tab that says Find Submit Distro. In the submenu, search for distro. Then it gives me these drop-down menus. I can filter my search here. I'm just going to choose Linux for the operating system type and leave everything else set to all. I'm going to click Submit, and it's going to return a very large list. Looks like currently on DistroWatch.com we have 279 distros listed. Now, is that all the distros? No, of course not. There's hundreds of other Linux distributions that are not listed on DistroWatch.com. They're just small operations or private operations that DistroWatch doesn't know about, that really the general public doesn't know about. But 279 distros listed on DistroWatch, that's a lot. That's a lot to choose from. As a new Linux user, which one? Well, Linux distros really, in my opinion, can be categorized in one of two categories. And, this may be oversimplifying things, but basically you have the big boys in the Linux world. You have the old guard, the Linux stalwarts. You have distros like Fedora, OpenSUSE, and Ubuntu that have been around for many, many years and are commercially backed by large companies. What does that mean? Well, it means, for one, they have a lot of money behind it. They have very large install bases. It's not hard to find support, community support, from forums, mailing lists, IRC, what have you. But they also offer commercial support for those that need it. That is the benefit of having a corporation behind a distribution. But in the old guard, I also consider the old distros, the very old distros that have been around forever and have a very large community-driven operation behind them. And those would include Debian and Slackware, which they've been around since almost the very beginning of Linux, and also Gentoo and Arch Linux. So really, those 7 distros, I don't want to, cause any controversy here, but I would say those 7 distros are really, the Linux distros. Those are the old guard. Those are the giants in the Linux world. Fedora, OpenSUSE, Ubuntu, Debian, Slackware, Gentoo, Arch Linux. So you have that group of distros, and then really you have everybody else. And what does that mean, everybody else? Well, everybody else is essentially basing their distro off the 7 that I already named. They're basically taking one of those distros, repackaging it, modifying stuff, adding stuff, removing stuff, and creating their own particular flavor of Fedora, OpenSUSE, Ubuntu, whatever. And in that group, I would divide that up into two different subgroups. I would divide that into official flavors of distros. Like Ubuntu has many official flavors of Ubuntu that they sponsor and support, like Kubuntu, Xubuntu, Lubuntu, Ubuntu Mate, and like a dozen more. There's a lot of officially supported versions of Ubuntu. And other distros do similar things. Just because you're not running mainline Ubuntu in this case, there are other Ubuntu spin-offs that are official, that you would get support, that have the full backing of Canonical and Ubuntu. And also these distros that are based on the big boys, you also have a very large category of those that are unofficial. You know, these do not have the official backing of the distro that they're based on. So again, with Ubuntu, you have distros based off it like Linux Mint, Elementary, Zorin, Bodhi, and hundreds of others. I mean, there's a ton of distros that are based off Ubuntu. And like I said, other than those few that Ubuntu specifically sponsors and supports, most of them have nothing to do with mainline Ubuntu. You can't go to the Ubuntu forums or mailing list or chat rooms and get support for your Linux Mint or Elementary or Zorin installation. You need to go to support channels for Linux Mint, Elementary, Zorin to get support for those particular distros. You know, in the Arch world, you have spin-offs like Manjaro, Antergos, Arch Bang, Chakra. Debian has a million distros that base off of it, like Deepin, Kali Linux, GNU Sense, Knoppix, and many more. In fact, in this list of the old guard, the giants of the Linux distro world, one of them is actually based off another in the list. Ubuntu is actually based off of Debian, but we still include Ubuntu because it's still been around forever. I mean, they've been around since, I think, 2004. So even though it's kind of the baby on the list, it and Arch Linux, I think, both around 2003, 2004. Most of these others have been around much longer. But Ubuntu is by far the most popular Linux distro on the desktop for sure, outpacing all others several times over, I would guess. Again, there's no real good way of measuring Linux distro popularity. There's no good metric out there, but you can be fairly certain Ubuntu is by far the most popular Linux desktop distro. So now, what is the difference between, say, installing one of these 7 in this old guard group and then, you know, some of these distros that are based off these? Well, as I said, you know, you have very large communities behind these, and in some cases you have corporations behind these distros getting support, finding information, you know, in wikis, and, you know, finding documentation that you can rely on is pretty easy in this group. You know, these are very well supported Linux distros. When you get into distros based off of those, now some of them have pretty good teams behind them, pretty decent sized development teams behind them, and pretty good communities behind it. I mean, things like Linux Mint, Elementary, Manjaro, even something like Deepin, you know, I wouldn't have too much of a problem with a new user installing those because they do have a decent community behind them. You know, they're not just going to be on their own. But really, once you stray very far from these original 7 here in the old guard list, you're getting into smaller distros that have very small development teams behind them, sometimes as small as one person. You have very small communities. When you go into some of the IRC channels for support, if I loaded up an IRC chat client right now and I logged into one of the Ubuntu support channels, there would be probably hundreds of people in it. getting a quick answer for something wouldn't be too difficult. Even a distro like Gen 2, which is really kind of a hardcore advanced distro, not for new users at all, but it has a sizable following behind it. When I go to a Gen 2 IRC channel, there's hundreds of people in it even. So it is not hard to get support on these distros up here. These distros down here, yeah, it's a crapshoot. Some have pretty good support, others not so much. A third group we should discuss, though, are newer Linux distros that are not based on any of these old guard distros. That these are basically independent distros. They basically created from scratch. They're not based on any of these, but they're still newer distros. I really don't know what to tell you about most of these. In this group you have things like Solus, Pardus, which was forked from Gen 2, so it was originally based on Gen 2, but they forked it and went in a totally different direction eventually. Really has nothing to do with Gen 2 anymore. You have Tiny Core Linux, and of course you have Linux from scratch, where you basically build Linux from scratch. Now that is super hardcore. It's something that, it's not for the faint of heart, but some people like it. There's actually a fourth category I didn't post here, and that would be dead Linux distros. There are just thousands of dead Linux distributions. Linux distributions that were created, ran for a little while, and the small development team behind them, often the one person behind them, just got tired of maintaining it, or burnt out, or lost interest, and that distro just fell by the wayside. And so for new users, again, I would stick to the old guard here, these top 7, but really I would stick to these top 3. These are your best bet. And out of those 3, I would stick to Ubuntu. For the very first distro you install, Ubuntu is the easiest install. It's got the biggest community. OpenSUSE is probably the second best for a new user. Fedora, I would not recommend Fedora for a new user. And then these down here, these 4, I wouldn't recommend any of those for a new user. You really should know your way around Linux for a little while before you install something like Debian or Arch Linux. Now, if you've been around for a year or two, you really know your way around Linux. The terminal doesn't scare you. Debian and Arch are not the hardest things in the world to get installed. Slackware and Gen 2, unless you're just a real Linux enthusiast, kind of hardcore, don't touch those. That's not for a new user, guys. So, peace.